Thank you for watching. If you would like to support the continued release of new stories, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Your participation is appreciated.
The rain stopped after 3 in the morning, leaving the world around the small farm draped in a wet, cold film. It was early May in the Northern Territories, and the air held the metallic snap of a late frost. Davis, the wildlife investigator, arrived as the sun failed to burn off the thick, low-hanging mist. Visibility measured 40 yards. It was the kind of gray, heavy light that made everything look old and used up. He pulled his official service pickup, still dusty from the gravel roads he had traveled, up beside a dented red barn. The smell hit him immediately, not just the usual pervasive tang of fresh manure and wet hay, but something sharper, something almost surgical. Blood, a large volume of it. The owner, a man named Henderson, stood slumped by the fence line, looking less like a farmer and more like a scarecrow that had finally given up. Davis did not need Henderson to tell him the details. They were laid out starkly in the muddy holding pen. 3 cows, prime stock by the look of their bulk, destroyed. But the nature of the destruction was wrong. Predators were messy. Bears ripped and tore, dragging carcasses off into the brush. Coyotes were scavengers, working the soft tissue. These animals had not been scavenged or even aggressively mauled. They looked dissected. The flesh was gone from specific, precise locations. Long, clean cuts that ran across bone and muscle fiber without tearing the surrounding tissue. It was too fast, too efficient. The metallic, sweet smell of the blood was sterile in its intensity. Cognitive dissonance thrummed low in his chest. His brain, conditioned by years of military service, and then by the dry realities of law enforcement, discarded the common denominators immediately. Mountain lion, bear, a very large pack of wolves. None of those fit the footprint he saw when he stepped carefully into the sticky, cold mud near the gate. He knelt, the cold seeping instantly through the knees of his sturdy work pants. The tracks were enormous, not round and padded like a bear's paw, but elongated, almost 5-fingered, yet lacking the opposable thumb of a primate. They sank deep, registering 800 pounds of tremendous weight, clearly more than any local creature. What truly unnerved him was the stride length. It was excessive, covering distances in a single silent pace that no known creature could manage without breaking into a run. These prints walked out of the pasture and disappeared into the dense pine thicket bordering the property, unhurried and terrifyingly decisive. It brought back the shadow of the man he had lost in the desert during his tour, a loss so sudden and illogical it had scarred his internal landscape forever. This was the same feeling. The sudden, brutal invasion of the ordinary. He noticed the profound silence. That was another piece of the puzzle that refused to slot into place. In a normal predator attack, the forest screamed afterward. Birds scattered, squirrels chattered their outrage, the insect chorus ramped up nervously. Now, the heavy air absorbed all sound. No birdsong, no buzzing flies, only the wet, rustling whisper of the wind through the topmost crowns of the hemlocks, and that suffocating pressure of quiet, like a vacuum left behind by something that had moved too quickly for the air to rush back in. It was unnerving, an environmental anomaly. Later that morning, driving deeper toward the ridges to consult the local ranger station, he stopped at a remote outpost manned by a grizzled man named Oscar, whose face was a roadmap of 60 years spent in the wilderness. Oscar had seen thousands of animals, categorized every scratch, every pile of scat. Davis showed him the high-resolution photos he had taken of the tracks and the wounds. Oscar did not speak for a long time, tracing the outline of the 5-pronged foot with a thick, calloused finger. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, showing the stark realization of ancient fright. "That is not on the list, investigator," Oscar said, his voice a dry, trembling rasp. He did not offer theories about bears or freak wolves. Instead, he spoke of the old dread, a hushed regional terror he had heard whispered around campfires decades ago, tales of a time when no sane soul ventured into those highest impenetrable ridges alone. Davis, the hardened pragmatist, immediately discarded the superstition, categorizing it as the frightened talk of aging woodsmen. But the story stuck to him like pitch, leaving a thick, unpleasant aftertaste. Back in the small, temporary apartment the agency provided him, Davis sat staring at the dull glow of his laptop screen. He meticulously typed out the report, forcing the bizarre findings into the dry, regulatory language of wildlife forensics. Nature of assault suggests unusually large, non-standard terrestrial predator. Further identification pending. His hands, however, were shaking slightly as he finished. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, strong enough to strip paint, and looked up at the wall map of the massive wilderness area. His gaze settled on the tangled mass of contour lines representing the tallest peaks. There, tucked deep into the map, was a specific unmarked location, an area the old ranger charts, decades old, had simply labeled inaccessible, or sometimes the Scar. That location, he noted with a sickening drop in his stomach, lay barely 10 miles as the crow flew from the current point of attack. He understood then that a rational explanation would not work this time. He felt the inescapable certainty that whatever had been sleeping up there was now awake. He stared at the map until the jagged lines began to swim, reflecting the fractured geometry of his own deepening anxiety. The coffee tasted like ash. The internal debate lasted until after midnight. Davis tried to convince himself that the tracks were simply an outlier, a massive, unrecorded hybrid, perhaps a grizzly with a rare mutation. But the precision of the cuts on the cattle, the oppressive silence, that felt deliberate, intelligent. He decided a closer look at the old scar on the map was necessary, even if it meant risking the treacherous, unmaintained service roads in the dark. He drove the pickup slowly, the twin beams of the headlights cutting shallow yellow cones into the overwhelming blackness. The air was colder now, pressing down from the mountain heights, heavy with the scent of damp pine needles and rock. Every few minutes, a blast of sound, a tire grinding over loose gravel, shattered the night, only to be swallowed again by the immense, indifferent quiet of the woods. He felt increasingly exposed, a slow, mechanized target moving through a landscape that did not recognize his right to be there. He rounded a particularly tight bend where the road narrowed to barely a single lane. His foot went instantly to the brake. The road was blocked. A vehicle, dark and utterly seamless, sat perpendicular to his path. It was a high-end, heavy-duty sport utility vehicle, black and gleaming even under the meager headlight wash, looking impossibly clean for the filthy roads it must have traveled. Before he reached for the handheld radio, 2 figures emerged from the shadows cast by the dense stands of ponderosa pine. One was a man, tall and slender, wearing a suit that looked expensive but utterly unremarkable, charcoal gray, impeccably tailored. This was Victor. His face was pale, his features chiseled and sharp, and his eyes, Davis registered them instantly, were two hard, sharp points of light that did not reflect the ambient gloom, but held their own inner fire. He moved with a devastating economy of motion. The second figure was a woman, Lyra. She was powerfully built, 5'11", with the coiled density of a high-performance athlete. She wore practical, dark outdoor gear, and her movements were not quick, but compressed, like a spring held too tightly. Her hair was dark, wet from the mountain air, clinging to her neck. They did not introduce themselves. They did not ask questions. They spoke assertions. Victor stepped toward the pickup, his gaze fixed on Davis. "Investigator Davis, we are here regarding it." His voice was low, resonant, carrying a precise, continental cadence that seemed out of place 10,000 feet up a remote logging trail. Davis, reacting instinctively, drew the heavy pistol he kept holstered beneath his seat. It was a habit born of years dealing with unpredictability. He aimed steady, centering the bore on Victor's chest. "Identify yourselves. You are blocking a federal route." Victor did not even twitch. He did not raise his hands. Instead, he slowly extended his left hand toward the front of Davis's pickup. The truck was a solid piece of American steel, built to withstand light collisions and heavy abuse. Victor curled his fingers slightly, applied absolutely no visible strain, and then slowly pulled his hand back. On the slightly dusty, thick steel of the front bumper, right beside the license plate, were 5 deep, perfectly parallel indentations. Not scratches, not dents. Perfectly formed gouges, as if someone had pressed a steel punch against the metal. "We are not your enemies, investigator," Victor said, his voice completely devoid of inflection. "The enemy is what is breathing beneath the mountain." Davis felt a cold wash of helplessness, a recognition that his weapon, his training, his reality was suddenly entirely insufficient. He lowered the pistol slightly, but kept it ready. Lyra spoke next, her voice gravelly and low, like stones rolling downstream. "The predator is not merely a predator, it is an ancient regulator. It existed long before our clans, before the cycles of the moon mattered, or the need for blood." She stepped closer, moving with that unsettling, fluid grace. "Its physiology ignores our weaknesses. It is absolute clean hunting. It was sealed, not destroyed. We believed the sleep would last centuries. We were wrong." Victor explained the history with the cold precision of a physicist detailing a catastrophic event. 30 years ago, a temporary truce between the varied ancient lines, vampire, lycanthrope, and the few skilled human hunters who understood the true threat, had been forged to contain this thing. They had managed to force it into a deep rock fissure and seal it beneath tons of reinforced earth. They had used toxins and cryogases to slow its impossible metabolism. Now, the earth was shifting, the seals were failing, and the creature was stretching its limbs. Lyra sensed his rising skepticism, the human resistance to the monstrous reality. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. Her skin was rough, firm, like dried wood, but the touch was surprisingly warm, grounding. "We need your logic, Davis. Your knowledge of the logistics of this earth. Your cover." She paused, her vertical pupils momentarily catching the light. "Because if it sees us working in our full capacity, it will learn how to trap us. You are the perfect disguise. The thought of working alongside creatures of myth, of sacrificing the entire framework of his life, was revolting. Yet, staring at the 5 perfect indentations on his bumper, Davis knew his choice was not about belief anymore. It was about survival. He holstered the pistol. They left the vehicles and began the ascent, long before the first hint of false dawn pierced the heavy canopy. Davis felt painfully slow, his heavily constructed leather boots clumsy on the slippery scree. He carried a military-grade pack, heavy with field equipment and 2 gallons of water. Lyra moved like a vapor. Her footfalls were nearly silent, her breathing an imperceptible rhythm. Her senses seemed extended, her head often cocked as her ears caught the almost inaudible scrape of loose rock a quarter-mile away. Victor, meanwhile, moved slightly above them, utilizing the forest verticality. He moved through the branches of the towering firs and pines with a soundless liquid momentum, his tailored suit miraculously untorn. His eyes were constantly scanning the middle distance, picking up the slightest variations in shadow and light that Davis's purely human vision failed to register. Davis felt like a lumbering anvil next to these 2 finely honed instruments of the wild, perpetually vulnerable. Victor guided them straight to the location marked the Scar on Davis's map. It was a bowl-shaped depression, tucked into a rocky shelf, sheltered from the wind. What Victor pointed out was not subtle. A colossal upheaval in the bedrock. 30 years of pressure, Victor whispered, his voice thin in the cold air. And a sudden, unimaginable expense of pure physical force. The area was a mess of shattered granite and pulverized shale. There was a sinkhole at the center, easily 20 feet across, looking less like a natural cave-in and more like something punched through from beneath. There was no residue of explosives, no evidence of hydraulic tools, just the clean break of stone subjected to force far beyond its tensile strength. The air here was noticeably colder, carrying a faint high scent of raw, freshly turned earth and scorched metal vapor, like the immediate aftermath of a massive electrical storm. The silence was even heavier here. They moved down the slope, following the path of destruction the creature had taken in its initial hungry exit. Soon they came across a small, fenced holding pen that bordered a high-altitude grazing allotment. They found a new victim there, a young bull, easily 1,200 pounds, its black hide still damp with the night's residual mist. Lyra approached the carcass slowly. She knelt, her face impassive, and ran her finger along the animal's flank. Her pupils were constricted to narrow, vertical slits, filtering the faint light. "It is feeding, but not out of hunger," she stated, her voice quiet. "It is rebuilding, not ripping, not tearing." Davis saw it then. The precision on the cow was repeated here, amplified by the bull's massive frame. But this time, the creature had pierced the rib cage. Lyra pointed. There were 5 perfect circular punctures, each about 1 inch in diameter, running diagonally across the bony structure. The animal had bled out internally, completely gutted by something that drilled rather than slashed. "He did not tear, Davis," Lyra repeated, the whisper chilling. "He cut. And he took what he needed efficiently." Victor, usually the embodiment of cool detachment, was visibly tense, his jawline hard. He could trace the molecular residue of blood faster than any forensic chemist, but he was listening instead, straining to hear something beyond the normal scope of reality. "He moved too quickly," Victor stated, turning from the carcass. "Our perception, even mine, only registered a flicker. It is not moving with a rush of blind instinct, investigator. It is moving with deliberate, adaptive speed. It is not pressed for time. It is simply restoring itself after a long, cold sleep. Victor elaborated on the creature's nature. It did not seek sustenance in the traditional sense. It metabolized energy and density, recovering from the cryostasis that had held it down for 3 decades. The bull was a battery recharge. The speed demonstrated that its core systems were already functioning at a level that dwarfed them all. Lyra moved to stand beside Davis. Her proximity made the air crackle with latent, contained strength. Her voice was low, piercing through the lingering, scorched metal vapor scent. "We have always been the apex, Davis. We are the terror in the dark, the monsters in the mythology. But it is a natural disaster. It precedes the mythology, and it remembers being trapped." She locked eyes with him, and in that moment, the depth of her 3 decades of dread was palpable. The initial hunt was a shock to its system. It was arrogant, careless. Now, it is merely regaining its memory, its capacity for pure, absolute hatred of the things that put it to sleep. And it will come for those who sealed it away. Davis looked from the perfectly punctured bull to the impassive faces of his monstrous allies. He was a man of protocols, of data points, of quantifiable threat assessment. But here, facing the reality of a threat that operated outside the laws of physics he understood, his fear ceased to be theoretical. It was a physical thing, a heavy, cold weight settling just beneath his sternum. The creature's path led them down the eastern slope, toward a relatively popular backcountry camping area, currently sparsely populated due to the season. The air grew stale as they approached the lower elevation, mixing the crisp mountain air with the manufactured smells of human recreation, faint cooking oil, pine smoke, and stale laundry. At the main campsite, they found the wreckage. It was not surgical this time. It was destructive, almost casual. 3 tents lay shredded, pulled apart as if by massive, indifferent hands. The fabric was ripped, not cut, a careless display of returning strength. Davis found a charred, overturned metal barbecue grill near the site of one tent. Beside it, the mud was disturbed, smeared with a residue that was not pine sap or dirt. It was the smell Oscar, the ranger, had described as part of the legend, and what Davis had briefly smelled on the wind. A bitter, oxidized metallic odor, like burnt lithium or rusted copper mixed with something sharp, nearly sterile, yet utterly organic. It was the scent of the predator. No bodies, no significant blood trails, just the empty, ruined camps. Whatever travelers had been enjoying the temporary calm of the woods had been eliminated, taken whole, without a struggle visible at the wreckage. That was the most terrifying fact. The lack of a fight suggested a speed that bordered on instantaneous. They followed the trail for another mile until they hit the gravel road. There, on a sweeping curve, lay a logging truck. It was a vast piece of heavy machinery, designed to carry 80,000 pounds of timber down steep grades. It was lying on its side, the tandem axles broken, the enormous metal chassis twisted and crumpled. It had been flipped, not rolled, not crashed. The cab was mangled. The thick metal skin peeled back and warped, the steering wheel bent into a horseshoe. It was a monument to impossible strength, as if a child had simply overturned a large toy and bent the plastic. The driver was gone. The internal wreckage was clean. No blood. The absence was deafening. It is not only regaining strength, Victor observed, running a gloved hand along a 4-inch thick steel support beam that was bowed outward. It is testing its capabilities, and ours. Davis had set up 2 trail cameras near the perimeter of the farm, high-resolution motion-activated units designed to withstand weather and animal curiosity, hoping to catch even a partial image of the thing. He found the sights now. Both cameras were destroyed. Not knocked down, but precisely crushed. The lenses were shattered inward, pulverized, while the surrounding plastic casings and mounting systems were barely scratched. The wires leading back to the transmission boxes were intact. It analyzed our tools, Victor whispered, his normally cold face now showing a flicker of true fear, a thin film of sweat across his brow. It distinguished the sensor from the casing. It knew what was watching and destroyed only the eyes. The sheer, adaptive intelligence of the creature cracked the last remnants of Davis's rational facade. He was not a detective anymore. He was a grunt in a war he was not authorized to fight against an enemy that defied every military manual ever written. The sight of the impossibly twisted metal of the truck cab brought back a rush of his deepest trauma. The memory of that sudden, pointless mortar strike that had vaporized his partner. The overwhelming, brutal finality of death delivered without reason or warning. This creature was that same force, absolute, instantaneous destruction delivered by something utterly alien. "We need eyes in the air and on the ground," Davis said, his voice flat, emotionless. He felt the cold objectivity of the soldier returning, the necessary detachment required to survive the unsurvivable. If it is learning, we need to confuse its sensor input. Lyra nodded, her gaze fixed on the darkening woods. "I will patrol the forest line, running off scent and the residual panic. That is easier for me to track than blood. Victor, you keep to the high canopy, move with speed, and watch for thermal variations. It runs hot. It generates colossal energy." She looked at Davis. "You stay on the ground. You are the nexus. You link us by radio. You watch the perimeter, and you carry the heavy weapons." The plan was accepted without further debate. Davis checked the load on his heavy rifle, the cold steel comforting in his hands. This was the first night he felt his flesh, beneath the layers of insulated clothing, becoming cold and rigid with the certainty of imminent confrontation. The hunt had been joined. The wait was the worst part. The moon was a sickly, half-formed disk struggling through the thinning cloud cover. Davis was hunkered down near an outcropping of jagged rock, visibility low, the air heavy with moisture. He kept the radio volume low, the static a constant, nerve-fraying whisper. Every gust of wind, every snap of a branch was a potential threat. Then, the static was violently interrupted. It was not a word or even a scream. It was a noise that sounded like effort abruptly halted. A choked, compressed snarl that was unmistakably Lyra, immediately followed by the terrifying sound of heavy impact, stone meeting resilient muscle. The burst lasted less than 2 seconds, then returned to sharp, heavy breathing and low, continuous static. "Lyra, report!" Davis shouted into the microphone, ignoring his own instruction to maintain silence. No answer. "Go. Northwest quadrant, half-mile from the truck." Victor's voice, usually so steady, was tight with urgency, transmitted through the faint air-to-ground link. Davis took off instantly, crashing through the brush in a desperate half-blind run. The terrain was brutal, slick rocks, hidden roots, sudden drops. He used his flashlight sparingly, trusting his memory of the map and the direction of the sound. The air grew suddenly warmer as he ran, and the bitter metallic smell intensified, making his sinuses ache. They found her in a small, grassy clearing surrounded by ancient hemlocks. Lyra was on the defensive, partially transformed. She was not the hulking, hair-covered beast of Hollywood myth, but something far more efficient. Taller, bulkier, her musculature profoundly enhanced, her nails like obsidian daggers. She was fighting. The predator was terrifyingly real. It was a massive, almost perfectly black silhouette against the faint moonlight, humanoid but grotesquely exaggerated. It stood 9 feet tall, its limbs thick and heavy, ending in those impossibly strong 5-fingered extremities. Its jaws were elongated, the teeth visible even in the gloom, chunks of ivory-colored horn. Davis saw the creature deliver a punch that was impossibly fast, a blur of motion that defied physics. It did not look like a strike. It looked like Lyra was abruptly thrown by an invisible, solid wall of force. She was launched backward 30 feet, striking a massive granite boulder with a sickening thud, momentarily stunned. Victor arrived an instant later, dropping from the canopy. He moved too fast for Davis to fully register, launching himself at the predator's back. As he did, he pulled a long, jagged piece of thick, dried root, hardened like ironwood, and drove it into the creature's massive shoulder. The predator did not cry out. It did not flinch. It merely acknowledged the annoyance. Davis caught the brief, sickening gleam of its eyes, twin points of malevolent burning amber reflecting the high, hazy moon. The retaliation was immediate. One swift, vertical swing of the creature's arm, a speed that seemed to tear the very air, caught Victor in the flank as he tried to disengage. Victor landed awkwardly, stumbling into the undergrowth, grasping his side. A patch of dark, almost black fluid was rapidly blooming across the expensive gray fabric of his suit. It was not the bright, shocking red of human blood. It was thick, viscous, like dark ink mixed with heavy oil. Davis reacted on instinct, the soldier seizing control. He dropped to one knee and sighted the heavy pistol, emptying the magazine in a focused burst aimed at the center mass. The noise was deafening in the sudden stillness. The impact of the slugs was sharp, distinct, like striking an engine block with ball bearings. The heavy, jacketed rounds did not penetrate. They struck the creature's dense hide and fell uselessly to the dirt, slightly flattened. The predator stopped its advance on the stunned Lyra. It turned its massive head toward Davis, emitting a sound that was pure friction, the grating screech of 2 massive stones grinding together. The bullets had not injured it. They had simply slowed it, annoyed it. It took one step toward Davis. But then, as rapidly as it had appeared, the creature dissolved into the shadows. Victor's strike, though futile, had accomplished its goal. It realized the target was complex and capable of slight defense. It would not linger unnecessarily. It evaporated into the absolute blackness of the tree line. Davis kept the weapon pointed at the empty space, his heart hammering against his ribs, his lungs burning with the sharp metallic stench the creature left behind. Lyra groaned, slowly pulling herself away from the boulder. Victor was hunched over, his breathing labored. His wound, a deep, ragged gash, was not closing. Vampiric healing was not instantaneous for something like this. It's strength. It suppresses our regeneration. Victor gasped, fighting for breath. The black fluid was still seeping. Lyra staggered toward them, her forehead already showing a deep, crescent-shaped laceration. She looked at Davis, her face a mask of pain and stark realization. It is not just powerful, Davis. It is toxic. Its sheer force contaminates us. We did not hurt it. We just made it angry. And our fear, for the first time in centuries, is not rhetorical. It is physical. They retreated to an abandoned, remote hunting cabin they had spotted on the map, built high on a ridgeline and protected by thick, overlapping brush. It was musty and smelled of mice and old leather, but it was dry and defensible. Victor was weak. He lay on a cot, his face ashen, the regeneration still struggling against the contamination. Lyra worked carefully on the wound, cleaning it with whatever sterile water they had, trying to reverse the infection that was not bacterial but elemental. It penetrated the outer layer of skin and muscle. But the real damage is deeper, Lyra said, her hands moving with the delicacy of a surgeon. It is hitting the core metabolic process. Using a pair of sharp field forceps, she gingerly probed the wound. She extracted a tiny shard, no bigger than a piece of gravel, which was lodged deep in the tissue. It was not bone. It was black, smooth, and had the faint sheen of polished obsidian, catching the cabin light with an unnatural, muted sparkle. Davis examined it under his pocket lens. It was not carbon-based. It was hard, dense, and unnervingly cold. Victor confirmed the observation weakly. Its teeth, its claws, they are silicon and heavy unknown metals, not from this biosphere. That is why our healing fails. It is poisoning us with the sheer density of its being. While Lyra maintained a vigil over Victor, checking his dangerously slow pulse, Victor began to talk about the legends of the first hunt. He spoke in clipped, dry sentences, the words emerging as a painful duty. The predator is intelligent, but not in a way you understand. It does not see us the way we see you, Davis. It perceives the world through vibration, through thermal signature, through the specific, unique frequency of fear and movement. He closed his eyes, his breathing shallow. It knows our heartbeats. It memorized the frequency of the bullets you fired. It is learning, adapting, eliminating noise that does not belong. Davis understood the eerie quiet now. The creature did not fear sound. It used silence as a sensory advantage, allowing it to isolate the target's unique identifying vibrations. Their attempt to kill it had been foolish. They needed to overload its inputs, to saturate its sensory system so thoroughly that it could not lock onto a single target. "We cannot eliminate it with force," Davis stated, looking at the black shard resting on the worn wooden table. "We replicate the process used 30 years ago. We seal it." Victor nodded, a barely perceptible movement. "We must slow its metabolism to absolute zero, force it back into cryostasis." Lyra, wiping the sweat from her brow, leaned forward. "They used a neurotoxin mixed with cryogases, something that bypassed the need for blood consumption and attacked the core nervous system via inhalation." Davis, who had been analyzing the contents of the old hunter's journal, pulled out the moldering leather book and turned to the final, frantic pages. The notes, written in a spidery, desperate hand, confirmed their suspicion. The hunter had called the toxin the deep sleep. It was the only way to counteract the creature's immense regenerative speed. "We need the formula, and we need the source," Davis declared, the investigator's drive resurfacing over the soldier's trauma. Victor confirmed that the ancient lines, fearful of its resurgence, had maintained a small, highly concentrated store of the necessary compound. It was sealed in a heavily shielded, temperature-controlled vault, buried deep in the mountains, accessible only to their kind. Retrieving it would be a dangerous logistical nightmare, consuming precious hours they might not have. "We have to build the trap first," Davis decided, pointing to the map. "We use the natural fracture near the summit, the one the old maps call the Widow's Tooth. It is deep, sheer, and can be structurally destabilized with explosives. We force it to fall. We gas it. We seal it." "And the bait?" Lyra asked, her voice steady despite her visible pain. There was only one logical answer, one lure powerful enough to override the creature's growing caution and analytical mind. Lyra's intense, controlled strength and her very essence, the smell of the ancient hunter line, the primal, challenging scent of the apex predator, would be the most compelling draw. "I will go in," she said, her voice entirely calm. "My challenge will be too great for its arrogance to ignore." The archives of the local forestry department were usually a haven of dusty silence, filled with dry timber reports and fire hazard assessments. Davis, using his badge and a plausible urgent cover story about a highly aggressive, newly cataloged bear species, managed to gain access to the restricted historical anomalies file. He was not looking for reports, but for personal records. He found the old, worn, leather-bound journal tucked inside a metal safe, smelling strongly of mold and dried pine needles. It belonged to the last known human hunter, who was part of the original containment team, a man who, records suggested, never returned to his civilian life after the incident. Davis opened the journal carefully. The entries were written over the course of about 8 months, their handwriting growing progressively more erratic and stressed. The hunter's initial entries were cocky, filled with the confidence of someone hunting a monster. The later entries were permeated by pure, unadulterated terror. August 14th. "We hunt a god who has forgotten sleep. Lyra's pack, Victor's line. Their power means nothing to it. It moves outside the speed of magic. It is not flesh. It is a moving hunger. Our strength is just a loud noise in its quiet, all-consuming world." The journal provided the emotional context for the fight they were facing. The creature was not a beast to be defeated, but a fundamental force to be avoided or contained. The hunter lamented the futility of their combined offensive, emphasizing that the creature felt no pain, only irritation. Davis realized that the creature's very existence nullified the ancient, carefully balanced power structure of the supernatural world. It was an equal opportunity destroyer. On the penultimate page, the hunter had sketched a rough, nervous diagram of the chasm they had selected 30 years prior, along with the precise chemical requirements for the deep sleep. The formula required a massive dose of a synthesized, powerful neurotoxin, which specifically targeted non-carbon-based life forms combined with ultra-low temperature, cryogases, specifically solidified methane and nitrogen, delivered directly into the air passage. The immediate freezing of the internal biological structure was the only thing that could stop its impossible regeneration long enough for the rockfall to seal it. Victor, though still feverish and weak, reviewed Davis's photos of the handwritten formula. "It is correct. We call it somnus, the sleep. My ancestors prepared enough for 3 cycles of containment. It is held in the high vault 3 hours from here, high above the tree line. The containment vessel is shielded against heat and impact, but it is heavy. The weight was an immediate logistical constraint. Davis calculated they needed at least 300 pounds of the mixture to saturate the massive vertical fissure they planned to use. Getting the metal containers up the mountain, along with the detonation charges and the structural beams needed to reinforce the trap, would be a superhuman feat. "We do not have time to retrieve it and build the trap," Davis concluded, frustration tightening his chest. "We need to move the clock forward." Lyra, her wounds now beginning to show signs of slow, grudging regeneration, stepped forward. "I already initiated the retrieval." "While you were gathering data, Victor used his access codes and sent 2 of my strongest young to retrieve the vessels. They are meeting us at the cabin before nightfall." Davis stared at her, impressed despite himself. The ancient lines worked with a grim, coordinated efficiency that made human bureaucracy look like children playing with blocks. They turned back to the map. The location they had chosen, the Widow's Tooth, was perfect. A sheer drop-off of nearly 400 feet, with surrounding, unstable rock formations that could be brought down with strategically placed charges. The location is set. The agents are arriving. "Now, we discuss the lure," Davis said, his voice dropping to a serious level tone. Lyra met his gaze without blinking. "I will be the lure. The scent of a powerful predator in transformation, running free. It will be irresistible to it. It sees me as the biggest challenge to its dominance. I am the strongest bait." Davis ran a hand over his tired face. Using a conscious, intelligent being as bait was a violation of every military and civil code he had ever sworn to uphold. Yet here, in the cold shadow of this monstrous reality, it was the only logical tactic. He looked at Lyra, seeing not a mythological beast, but a warrior accepting an untenable duty. The next 3 days were a blur of grueling, punishing labor. Lyra's 2 associates arrived, tall, silent individuals with the same intense, tightly leashed energy, carrying the metal vessels containing the Somnus mixture. The canisters were heavy, sealed in vacuum-insulated shells, and radiated an unnatural cold, even at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. They smelled faintly of mint and aggressive cleaning fluid, a strange chemical counterpoint to the organic odors of the mountain. The climb to the Widow's Tooth was relentless. The terrain was steep, choked with treacherous loose rock, forcing them to use ropes and climbing gear to haul the heavy payload. Davis's human body protested with every step. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, and his combat boots felt filled with lead. He worked side by side with creatures that could run up the sheer face of the rock, yet he kept pace, driven by a pure, terrible sense of responsibility. His military training had taught him that the mission precedes personal comfort, and this was the most crucial mission of his life. They installed the steel supports and complex cabling required to ensure the unstable ledge would collapse precisely where they needed it to. They placed the Somnus containers at strategic points inside the fissure, rigged to rupture and aerosolize the compound the moment the fall occurred. The mechanism required coordination, a trigger to break the fall, and a secondary trigger to set off the main rockfall charge. The tactical plan was refined until it was spare and brutal. Lyra would start her route 2 hours before the trap was sprung, moving with challenging intensity, drawing the predator's attention. Davis, carrying the final detonation plunger and a heavy rifle, would be positioned nearest the fissure edge, providing the critical moment of distraction if the creature hesitated. Victor, still recovering, would monitor the remote sensors and control the main winch system intended to slow the creature's fall slightly, ensuring it landed exactly in the gas cloud. The evening before the final execution, they sat near a small, carefully shielded fire in the lee of the ridge. The air was still, cold, dropping toward 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The silence of the mountain was back, but now it felt like a drawn breath. The conversation was minimal, punctuated only by the crackle of burning pine. Lyra stared into the low flames, her face illuminated by the flickering orange light. She had an extraordinary peace about her, the acceptance of a terrible fate. "The world does not need to know about us," she said, her voice soft but steady, directed at Davis. "But it especially must never know about it. The knowledge alone would eliminate the species." Victor, leaning against a rough-hewn rock, his features gaunt from his injury, merely watched the darkness. His eyes were the color of deep shadow, reflecting the immense weight of centuries of fear and duty. He spoke only once, a low, grave utterance. "The memory of the hunter is shorter than the memory of the beast. We must make this memory long." Davis did not offer reassurances or false hope. He just checked the action on his rifle again, feeling the smooth, cold weight of the metal. He was not thinking about the moral implications or the sheer horror of the situation. He was counting bolts, checking the tension in the ropes, visualizing the angle of the detonation charge, the geometry of the collapse. The emotional part of him had shut down. The soldier had taken command, reducing the impending world-ending confrontation to a complex, demanding engineering problem. His mind was a blank slate, waiting for the final countdown, and in that professional numbness, he found a terrible calm. He knew with absolute certainty that he was ready to do what needed to be done, regardless of the cost to his own continued path. They moved into position at 2 hours past midnight, high on the granite spine of the ridge. The cold was brutal, settling deep into the marrow of the bones, yet Davis barely noticed. Adrenaline and the heavy responsibility of the mission had created a pressurized internal heat. The sky was the color of old oil, starless, the moon entirely obscured by an immense, moving blanket of moisture and fog that rolled in from the valleys. The air here was exceptionally dense, and the sound absorption was total. There was no wind, no chirping, no natural movement. It was the kind of absolute stillness that strained the inner ear, making the blood pulse audibly in the temples. Lyra left first. She wore only dark, heavy clothing, moving away from the assembled machinery of the trap and toward the deep wood. She did not look back. She walked slowly, deliberately, projecting the powerful, challenging scent of transformation, a concentrated beacon for the ancient hunter. She was the challenge, the dare. Davis settled into his firing position, tucked behind a massive, wind-eroded granite outcrop 10 yards from the lip of the fissure. He had a clear view of the area Lyra would loop through before leading the creature toward the weak point of the ridge. His heavy rifle was mounted on its bipod, aimed. The waiting was a physical ordeal. Time ceased to function linearly, stretching out into a cold, endless present. He focused on his breathing, the familiar meditative rhythm he had mastered in combat zones. After what felt like 1 hour, the silence broke in a chilling way. It was not sound. It was sensation. The bitter, acrid smell of oxidized metal and scorched metal vapor returned, sharp and overwhelming, riding a current of air that was suddenly several degrees warmer. It hit Davis like a physical blow, a sick-making blend of industrial waste and rank biological decay. The predator was near. Davis squinted into the gloom. He strained his eyes, trying to differentiate shadow from substance, rock from creature. The blackness was impenetrable. Then he saw them. Far across the dark slope, maybe 300 yards away, 2 tiny pinpricks of light appeared. Amber. They were not reflecting light. They were generating it, burning with a steady, low internal heat. They were level, steady, and they were moving. Slowly. The creature was cautious. It knew the smell of the trap, the smell of the human technology, the faint scent of the gas. But the challenge of Lyra's primal scent, the irresistible draw of a rival alpha, was overriding its intelligence. The predator was stalking, not charging. It was allowing the hunt to develop. The movement was deliberate, calculating, closing the distance between itself and Lyra. Then, the vibration began. It was not the sound of steps. It was the transference of colossal, concentrated mass. The earth did not shake like a conventional tremor. Instead, the vibration passed through the stone itself, through the soles of Davis's boots, directly into the bones of his legs and spine. It was a deep, resonating hum that felt less like movement and more like the focused discharge of pure physical power. The predator was moving with a targeted, heavy gait, conserving speed until the final necessary moment. It was close now, its massive silhouette barely visible against the dark gray rock. Davis could hear the faint, scraping friction of its feet against the stone. It was coming for the lure. It was coming for them all. The silence that preceded it was the quiet of the grave. The full magnitude of the creature's speed was horrifying. One moment, it was a dark, distant mass. The next, it was at the edge of the clearing. It did not run. It propelled itself with a velocity that defied comprehension, covering 100 yards in a flicker. The attack on Lyra was immediate, a devastating blur. She roared, an inhuman sound of pain and challenge as she tried to finalize her transformation, but she was too slow. The predator was upon her, pinning her with a massive clawed hand. Davis aimed and fired instantly, a stream of heavy rounds ripping into the creature's back and head. The noise was terrifying, amplified by the silent air. The slugs struck with dull thuds, shedding their copper casings as they deformed against the dense hide. They did not injure the thing, but they distracted it. The predator paused, turning its massive head toward the new source of noise, its amber eyes fixed on Davis, 2 cold, burning points of pure animosity. Lyra used the fractional pause, thrashing violently, transforming fully into her wolf form, a huge, powerful animal, black as pitch. She used her newly mobilized strength to tear free, slamming her body into the rock behind her. The creature turned, its attention shifting back to the most challenging target. Lyra was thrown again, tossed aside like a discarded pelt, her body striking a nearby support beam. The wood groaned under the impossible impact. Now, Victor, now. Davis screamed into the radio. Victor, positioned safely on the far side of the gorge, threw the first lever. The steel cables tautened with a sharp, whining groan. The center of the ridge, weakened by their strategic drilling, began to sag. The predator ignored the mechanical noises. It was focused entirely on the human with the loud, annoying weapon. It raised its enormous arm to strike. Davis saw the movement begin. The sheer acceleration was sickening, like watching a rifle slug in slow motion. He knew the impact would eliminate him instantly. He did not freeze. He had accounted for this inevitability. At the last possible second, he executed a practiced low combat dive, throwing himself sideways and down toward the ground, away from the immediate target zone. The creature, too focused on the vertical strike and too massive to halt its instantaneous momentum, overshot. Its enormous weight landed on the precisely weakened lip of the fissure. The stone gave way with a sound that was a sickening combination of grinding friction and sharp, explosive cracking. The predator did not fall so much as it disappeared, its weight taking the entire engineered section of the ridge with it. A gut-wrenching, thunderous roar erupted from the deep chasm as the immense creature struck the bottom. "Gas!" Davis yelled, scrambling back to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder from the frantic dive. Victor activated the secondary charge, shattering the heavily insulated containers of Somnus. A plume of thick, noxious vapor, white and unnaturally cold, billowed immediately up from the dark, open maw of the fissure. Davis reached the lip, pulling the detonator. He had 2 seconds. He slammed the button down. The detonation charges exploded, not with a clean, surgical blast, but with a terrible grinding sound of total collapse. Tons of granite, shale, and loose earth ripped away from the ridgeline, cascading down into the fissure. The noise was apocalyptic, a terrible thunder that ripped through the mountain air. Davis shielded his eyes, enveloped in dust and the sharp freezing sting of the cryogas. The noise lasted for 2 full minutes, the relentless roar of gravity doing its work, followed by the terrifying, continuous grinding of massive stone pieces settling upon each other. Then, silence. It was an exhausted, absolute quiet, broken only by the faint, high-pitched hiss of the final pockets of Somnus escaping the rubble, freezing the air around the newly sealed chasm. Davis pushed himself up onto his elbows, his entire body aching from the strain and the fall. The smell of gun smoke, pulverized rock, and the sharp chemical odor of the Somnus hung heavy in the cold air. The chasm was gone, replaced by a massive, sloping field of fresh rubble, tons of granite fused together by the sheer force of the impact and the sudden, intense cold of the cryogas. They had not defeated the creature. They had merely buried it deeper, adding another, thicker layer of stone insulation to its stasis. Lyra stumbled out of the darkness, slowly, painfully returning to her human form. Her clothing was shredded, her skin was covered in deep lacerations, but they were already closing, the powerful regeneration finally overcoming the predator's debilitating toxicity. She looked utterly exhausted, her eyes heavy with the weight of the fight. Victor appeared from the periphery, moving stiffly. He was pale, leaning heavily against a remnant of the winch structure, but he was alive. They looked at the newly sealed mountain face. No triumph existed here, only profound, draining relief. They had done what they set out to do. Lyra walked toward Davis, her movements still unsteady. She extended a hand, rough and bruised. Davis grasped it, the contact solid and immediate. A wordless acknowledgement of shared, catastrophic experience passed between them. Victor stepped closer, his voice thin and dry. The threat is nullified, temporarily. He looked at the massive mound of fresh rock. It will sleep. It will metabolize its wounds and the toxin. It will not be centuries, Davis. It will be decades. He did not offer a farewell, only a statement of fact, a grim prediction. Lyra and Victor began to move away, dissolving into the lifting mountain fog. They were creatures of the night, bound by the ancient pact, retreating to their hidden world to tend their wounds and wait for the next cycle. Their silhouettes grew indistinct, fading into the dense gray vapor. Victor turned just before disappearing entirely. "You know what is coming. You are its witness." Then he was gone. Davis was left alone on the scarred ridge. He looked toward the east, where the sky was lightening, transitioning from oily black to a pale, indifferent gray. The cold, silent dawn was beginning. Below him, the world was waking up. The towns, the farms, the people living their small, intricate routines, blissfully ignorant of the fundamental existential terror that had just been forced back into its cold sleep 10 miles above them. He was the only human connection, the only one who carried the terrible knowledge of the sheer speed and absolute power that waited beneath the rock. He felt the physical exhaustion, the profound emptiness that followed the cessation of absolute dread. He retrieved his rifle and his pack, the weight comforting and familiar. He had to descend, return to his normal life, and write a final, heavily redacted report detailing a bizarre geological event and an unusually large deceased animal. As he moved down the slope, his boots crushing the wet pine needles, Davis knew his world was now irrevocably split. There was the visible world of logic, routine, and quantifiable danger. And then there was the hidden world of silicon teeth, suppressed regeneration, and the cold, eternal hunger that slept beneath a mountain of granite. He was a wildlife investigator again, but he was also something else now. A sentry, a keeper of the secret, waiting for the geological shift, the faint tremor, the first subtle return of the bitter scent of oxidized metal. He had done what was necessary to preserve the quiet, fragile reality of the human world. And in the face of the unspeakable, that was enough.